Did you know most canned tomato brands are hiding something? You've probably bought one this week without a second thought. Same brand as always, straight into the pot. But what's on the front of that can, and what's actually inside it? Two very different things. 10 brands, one investigation. Starting with the ones I'd put back on the shelf, ending with 5 that actually hold up. The brand most people trust the most is number 1 on the avoid list. And that's not an accident. Number 10. Store brand generic. No heritage story, no family name, no imported imagery. Just a plain can at the bottom of the shelf, priced below everything else in the aisle. Most shoppers assume the expectation and the reality are already aligned here. Nobody grabs a store brand expecting something exceptional. It costs less. Simple transaction, and on the surface, that logic holds up fine. But here's something the price point doesn't tell you. Check the facility information buried in the fine print on the back of that can. The same canning facility frequently supplies both the store brand and a recognizable name brand sitting one row above it, sometimes off the same production line, repackaged under a cheaper label at a lower price point. The tomatoes inside may be functionally identical to a product charging 30 to 40% more and wrapping itself in full-color heritage imagery to justify that difference. That means when you're choosing the store brand to save money, you may already be getting roughly the same product as the premium option beside it. But you're also getting the same calcium chloride, the same citric acid, and the same can lining questions that apply to every metal can in this category. No story on the label doesn't mean no questions about what's inside. It just means nobody wrote the story down. And in this category, that actually makes the store brand one of the more honest options at the lower end of the list, even if the formula itself isn't cleaner. Number 9. Firmenose. This is the regional trust pick. In certain parts of the country, Firmenose has been on shelves long enough that shoppers don't compare it to anything nearby. It's just the tomato brand, the one that's always been there, the one their parents bought, and their grandparents before that. That kind of shelf presence builds a specific type of loyalty that doesn't require advertising to maintain. Someone carefully managing a health condition, tracking every ingredient, building meals around reliable basics, might reach for a long-running regional name because decades of presence feel like quality assurance. Like a brand that old must have kept its formula simple, while other brands quietly added things that don't belong. Here's what the timeline actually shows. Firmeno's ingredient list has expanded alongside the rest of the mass-produced category. Calcium chloride and preservatives appear in the current lineup that would not have featured in earlier versions of this product. Back when it first started moving through regional distribution, the formula changed. The label design largely didn't. The familiar packaging never signaled that what's inside had quietly evolved to match what the national competitors were doing. That's the specific problem here. It's not that the brand is uniquely bad. It's that the label gives no indication the formula shifted. A shopper buying this today, based on a decades-old reputation, is making a decision about a different product than the one that built that reputation. The can lining concern applies here, the same as it does to every metal can covered today. High-acid tomatoes interacting with certain lining materials is a question regulators have studied for years without a full industry-wide resolution. Decades of shelf presence explain how a name stays familiar. They don't explain why the ingredient list kept growing while the can looked exactly the same. Number 8. Red Gold, the budget pick. Priced below most competitors in the same aisle, with a value proposition that makes complete sense on the surface. Chopped tomatoes are chopped tomatoes. The brand shouldn't change what's inside, right? Here's what that price actually reflects. Red Gold relies more heavily on calcium chloride and citric acid than several pricier competitors. Those additives handle the texture and shelf stability work that higher quality raw tomatoes would otherwise do on their own. They're a cheaper input than better tomatoes. Sodium content also runs toward the higher end of this category, a trade-off that never shows up anywhere near the price tag drawing shoppers toward this can in the first place. Open one and look at the tomato pieces, almost identical in shape and firmness, piece after piece. That uniformity is manufactured. Fresh tomatoes don't behave that way. Additives produce that result, when the base tomato alone can't hold that shape through processing and distribution. The issue isn't that it's affordable. Affordable products can be honest products. The issue is that the lower price is being achieved through a higher additive load rather than through genuine efficiency or better sourcing. A family stretching a grocery budget deserves actual value, not the same additive pattern found in more expensive brands applied more heavily because the raw material underneath costs less. The price explained itself. The next brand takes a completely different angle and charges considerably more for the story it's telling. Number 7. Tutto Rosso, the premium-looking pick. Everything about the branding signals Italian tomato tradition. The name, the imagery, the language printed across the packaging. Sun-grown tomatoes, careful harvesting, a process that feels closer to an Italian farmhouse than a modern processing facility. A health-conscious shopper, someone specifically focused on sourcing and ingredient quality, reaches for this because the tradition marketing implies something cleaner and more carefully produced than a generic domestic alternative. That's exactly what the branding is designed to communicate. And at the price point this product sits at, that implication is doing real work in the purchasing decision. Here's where the gap opens up. Tutto Rosso sources a significant portion of its supply domestically. American-grown tomatoes going into a product marketed heavily around an Italian tradition that the actual supply chain doesn't fully reflect. The imagery on the front and the origin of the tomatoes inside are telling two different stories at the same time. Sodium and additive content tracks closely with the domestic mass-produced brands already covered. Nothing about the formula meaningfully separates this product from the competitors it positions itself above through visual identity and pricing alone. Taste it plain, and it reads fine, pleasant even, but it doesn't carry the distinct brightness and character that a genuinely single-origin imported tomato brings to the same comparison. The sourcing story and the product in the can aren't fully aligned. An Italian tradition on the label doesn't put Italian tomatoes in the can. That's not what most shoppers paying the premium price think they're getting. And that gap between the marketing and the reality is exactly what makes this brand worth flagging. Those first four are the lower concern end of this list. What's coming next is where it gets more significant. Hidden corporate ownership, misleading sourcing claims, and the most trusted name in the entire category hiding something behind a four-word slogan. Stay with me. Number 6. Progresso crushed tomatoes, the autopilot pick. Progresso has been on shelves long enough that most shoppers aren't actively choosing it anymore. They're just continuing to buy it. That kind of familiarity doesn't require loyalty. It runs entirely on momentum. Someone managing blood sugar carefully often reaches for plain crushed tomatoes as a simple, controllable base ingredient. Straightforward product, simple label. Crushed tomatoes don't seem like something that needs close scrutiny. Check the sodium panel before that assumption settles in. Across Progresso's crushed tomato lineup, sodium runs considerably higher than the simplicity of the product implies. A single serving, before any additional seasoning gets added during cooking, already contributes a meaningful share of a full day's recommended limit. For someone building a recipe that will absorb more sodium as it reduces on the stove, that starting point matters more than the label makes obvious. You could be cooking a meal that feels homemade and lightly seasoned, while the base you started with was already doing significant sodium work before you added a single pinch of salt. Calcium chloride and citric acid appear here too, and the texture in the pot holds that same engineered consistency found across the mass-produced category. The natural batch-to-batch variation you'd expect from a less processed tomato simply isn't there. Familiarity earns loyalty without effort. That's exactly why the sodium count on a brand like this rarely gets checked. It feels too established to question, but the panel on the back doesn't change based on how long the brand has been on the shelf. Number 5. Dei Fratelli, the personal pick. Two brothers on the label, an Italian-American family story woven into every can the brand sells. The name translates directly to "of the brothers" in Italian. The whole identity is built around warmth. The idea that what's inside came from a recipe somebody's grandmother would recognize, not a formulation somebody's accountant approved. Families with young children Reach for this specifically because it feels more trustworthy than an obviously corporate competitor sitting right beside it on the shelf. A family name implies a different set of priorities, a smaller operation, more care put into each batch. The origin is real. Dei Fratelli did start as a family operation. That foundation is genuine and worth acknowledging directly. What the can doesn't communicate is how substantially the operation has scaled since that founding. The company now runs at industrial processing volumes, using the same methods found across the mass-produced category. The brothers are still on the label. The scale behind those brothers is a different conversation entirely, one the packaging doesn't invite you to have. Calcium chloride and citric acid appear across the lineup. The same ingredients documented in every brand already covered today. Pour it into a pot and the texture is indistinguishable from every other additive-assisted product on this list, regardless of how personal the label makes the whole thing feel. A family built real trust with a genuine story. The factory that grew around that story became something the label was never updated to reflect. That gap is the thing worth knowing before you reach for it. Number 4. Cento. The genuine import. And that distinction is worth crediting directly, because unlike several brands already covered, Cento's sourcing claim actually holds up in a meaningful way. Real Italian tomatoes for a significant portion of the lineup. A real point of difference, especially compared to domestic competitors borrowing Italian imagery without a single Italian tomato behind it. But here's where the story gets more complicated, and this is important because Cento is the brand a lot of informed shoppers have already settled on as their trusted option. Sodium content across several Cento products runs at levels comparable to the mass-produced domestic brands already on this list. The assumption most shoppers bring to a genuinely imported product is that authentic sourcing means a cleaner overall profile, that a tomato grown and processed in Italy arrives with less processing and less intervention than something produced domestically. The sodium numbers don't support that assumption. Import supply chains also introduce their own traceability considerations. Blending or repackaging can occur at multiple points between an Italian farm and an American shelf. Something the heritage branding rarely addresses in any meaningful detail. The story on the front of the can doesn't follow the tomato through every step of the journey. The tomato flavor does read brighter than domestic competitors when tasted plain. The sourcing makes a genuine difference in character, and that deserves honest acknowledgement. This isn't a brand without merit, but flavor in the pan and sodium on the label are two separate conversations, and the label only features one of them prominently. Real heritage earns real credit. It doesn't earn a pass on the nutrition panel sitting right beside it. Number 3. Cadia. This one sounds completely independent. The name reads like something sourced from a quiet corner of the Italian countryside. The branding reinforces it. Imagery suggesting a small traditional operation, a family that has been growing and processing tomatoes the same way across generations. A shopper moving quickly through the aisle and choosing this over a more obviously corporate option is doing so because it feels more traceable, more authentic, more like it came from a specific place rather than a corporate portfolio. What the label doesn't say anywhere is the one thing that changes the entire picture. Cadia is a Del Monte brand. Same parent company, different name, completely different visual identity. Same corporate structure, same sourcing decisions, same additive framework. Two brands designed to look like independent competitors sitting beside each other on the same grocery shelf. And that shared ownership appears nowhere on either can. This matters beyond just the ingredients. When a parent company launches a second brand under a different name and different aesthetic, the goal is to capture shoppers who would have skipped the original. Someone who walked past Del Monte because it felt too corporate might pick up Cadia because it feels independent. The product inside is built on the same decisions. The story on the outside is a different one entirely. Sodium and calcium chloride content across Cadia tracks closely with Del Monte products because a different logo rarely means a different formula. It means a different shopper is being reached through a different story built around the same product. Set a can of Cadia next to a can of Del Monte in the same pot. The texture behaves identically. The same manufactured firmness. The same calcium chloride, doing the same work across the entire portfolio regardless of which name is printed on the outside. Two names on the same grocery shelf. One parent company wearing two different masks. A shopper choosing Cadia for its independence, paid for a story the ingredients don't back up. If this investigation is changing how you read a label, a like helps this reach more people who are still buying the same can without knowing any of this. Number 2. Del Monte. The century-old name. Del Monte has been on American grocery shelves for over 100 years. And that length of time creates a specific kind of trust that newer brands simply can't manufacture. Shoppers don't question it. A name that established feels like it must have earned its place through quality, not just distribution, not just marketing, something more durable than that. Consider someone carefully managing blood pressure, tracking sodium at every meal, following medical guidance, trying to control exactly what goes into the food they cook. A century-old name feels like a safe baseline, something so established it doesn't need a second look. Check the sodium panel before that logic settles in. Across Del Monte's chopped tomato lineup, sodium runs high enough that a single serving carries a meaningful percentage of a full day's recommended intake before any additional seasoning gets added during cooking. For anyone monitoring sodium carefully, the can is already working against the daily limit before the stove even heats up. That's a significant detail for a product that most health-conscious shoppers reach for without checking, precisely because the name feels trustworthy. The can lining concern applies here the same as it does to every metal can on this list. High-acid tomatoes against certain lining materials is a question regulators have been studying for years. No full industry-wide resolution has been reached. That doesn't mean every can is a problem, but it does mean the question is open, and it applies to Del Monte the same way it applies to everything else in a metal can. Taste a spoonful straight from the can before it hits the stove. The sodium registers before the tomato does. That's information about how much processing this product absorbed and how much was added to compensate for a base tomato that traveled a long way before reaching your kitchen. 100 years on the shelf is a genuine achievement. It doesn't revise the nutrition panel to match the trust that Century built without anyone looking closely at it. The brand at number 1 is the one most Americans are cooking with tonight, and it's the one hiding the most behind the fewest words printed on the can. This is the one that matters most. Number 1. Hunt's. That red can is in more American pantries than almost anything else in this category. Bottom shelf, top shelf, end caps, bulk displays at warehouse stores. It's the weeknight sauce staple that most families have never once questioned because it's always just been there. The default choice. The one that doesn't even feel like a decision anymore. 4 words are printed across that can: grown, not made. 4 words designed to make you feel like the ingredient list ends at the tomato. Like everything inside came straight off a vine, with nothing added between the field and the lid. It's one of the most effective slogans in the entire grocery store, because it implies purity without technically promising it. Flip it over. Citric acid, calcium chloride. Both present across the Hunt's lineup. Citric acid controls acidity during processing. Calcium chloride keeps tomato pieces holding a uniform, consistent shape through canning, storage, and distribution. Neither one belongs in a homemade sauce. Both of them are on that label directly below a slogan built entirely around the promise of simplicity. That's the specific contradiction here. The front of the can is selling the idea of a tomato that needed nothing added. The back of the can tells you what was actually added. Those two things don't line up. Hunt's operates under a large food conglomerate. The same corporate structure, sitting behind dozens of other recognized pantry staples. That ownership doesn't automatically make the product harmful, but it does explain why a brand whose entire identity is built around a simplicity claim carries an ingredient list that quietly contradicts it. When you're operating at that scale, even a small per-unit cost reduction across millions of cans compounds into enormous savings. Additives that extend shelf stability and improve visual consistency are financially rational at that volume. The slogan stays simple. The formula doesn't have to. The acid interaction question applies here too. High-acid produce like tomatoes interacts differently with certain can lining materials than lower-acid vegetables sitting in the same aisle. Regulators have been studying this. The question hasn't been fully resolved at the industry level. That open question applies to every metal can on this list, but it applies first and most visibly to the category's most trusted brand. Open the can, pour it into the pot, watch the tomato pieces hold their shape, uniform, consistent, piece after piece. That's not what fresh tomatoes do under heat. That's the calcium chloride doing exactly the job it was added to do. Grown, not made, describes the tomato. It says nothing about what was added to it before the lid was sealed. The most trusted can in America earned the top spot on this list, not despite that trust, but because of it. That's what makes it the most important brand to understand on this entire countdown. When a product this familiar is this worth questioning, the whole category deserves a second look. Now you know what to look past. Here are the 5 that actually held up. These brands face the same shelf pressures, the same cost incentives, the same regulatory environment, and made different choices. Their ingredient panels reflect that. Let's go through them from a solid option up to the one worth knowing about most. Best option number 5. Trader Joe's Organic Diced Tomatoes, the practical everyday pick. This is a private label that actually earns its organic certification rather than borrowing the store's curated reputation as a substitute for what's on the label. Sourcing is disclosed with more transparency than most store brand competitors offer. The organic certification reflects a real production standard, not a positioning strategy designed to justify a higher shelf price. The price lands considerably below several name-brand organic competitors in the same aisle, without sacrificing the certification those brands charge more to carry. That combination, organic standard, honest sourcing disclosure, accessible price, is genuinely uncommon in this category. Cook with it, and the flavor holds up as fresh tasting in a way that the mass-produced alternatives don't match. A shorter path from harvest to can shows up clearly the moment it hits a hot pan. You can taste the difference between a tomato that spent less time in processing and one that was heavily managed to stay shelf-stable for longer. If you want organic, affordable, and straightforward, this is where that combination actually exists in this category without compromise. Best option number 4. Pommes, the one that removes the can entirely. Pommes comes in aseptic carton packaging instead of metal. That single packaging decision sidesteps the lining question running through nearly every brand on the avoid list without needing to defend any specific material or ask shoppers to trust a claim they can't verify themselves. You're not choosing between a good lining and a bad one. You're removing the variable completely. The ingredient list across most pommes varieties is one item: tomatoes. That's the complete formulation. A simplicity that several brands on the avoid list claimed on the front of their packaging and then quietly complicated on the ingredient panel on the back. Taste it plain, and the flavor reads clean. The faint metallic edge that some shoppers notice in canned competitors, produced by a lining they can't see and can't evaluate, doesn't appear here because there's no metal lining to introduce it. No can, no lining question, one ingredient. If eliminating that variable matters to how you shop, this is the most direct way to do it. Best option number 3. Jovial Organic Whole Tomatoes in Glass. Glass packaging takes the logic from pommes one step further and adds an organic certification on top of it. No metal can, no carton. Glass introduces none of the acid interaction questions that metal linings carry across this entire category. For anyone who has been thinking about that concern since the first few brands on the avoid list, glass removes the variable entirely, rather than just defending against it with marketing language. Jovial follows a traditional Italian glass packing method that keeps processing minimal and keeps the tomatoes closer to their original form than nearly any competitor in the same aisle. Pour them out, and the texture holds naturally. No manufactured firmness. No additive doing structural work the tomato should be doing on its own. The pieces vary slightly in size and texture, which is exactly what real tomatoes look like before a processing line standardizes them. The organic certification is real. The glass format handles both the lining concern and the processing concern simultaneously through packaging choices rather than through reassuring language printed on a metal can. If both of those things factor into how you choose, this is the product that addresses both at once without asking you to compromise on either. Best option number 2. Muti, the genuine Italian import. And unlike Cento at number 4 on the avoid list, the full picture here holds up when you actually look into it. Single origin tomatoes grown and processed within Italy, not blended from multiple sources to hit a price point, and then dressed in Italian-sounding language on the outside of the can. The sourcing claim and the product inside it are consistent with each other, which after everything covered on the avoid list is not something you can take for granted just because a label sounds Italian. Muti publishes sourcing information clearly rather than relying on vague heritage language designed to sound meaningful without committing to anything verifiable. Several brands on the avoid list were already positioned to offer that kind of transparency. They had the imagery, the heritage angle, the premium price point. They chose not to back it up with specifics. Muti does. Taste it before it goes into the pot. The brightness is distinct and immediately noticeable. The difference between a verified single-origin tomato and a blended domestic product dressed in Italian packaging is not subtle when you put them side by side. Cook it down and the texture breaks apart, the way a fresh tomato actually behaves under heat, not the way an additive-assisted product holds its manufactured shape through the process. Real Italian heritage, a sourcing claim that survives a closer look. In this category, that combination is rarer than the shelf makes it appear. Best option number 1, Bianco di Napoli, a direct, long-standing partnership between one farming family and one processor. Verified season after season. Not sourced from a rotating anonymous supply chain that shifts suppliers whenever the cost works out better somewhere else. For anyone who has spent years buying brands with traceability claims that dissolve the moment you look into them, this structure is a concrete and verifiable difference. There's no corporate sourcing portfolio quietly substituting inputs when the quarterly numbers need adjusting. One farm, one processor, the same arrangement maintained consistently over time. That's an unusual thing to be able to say in the mass-market canned tomato category, and it shows up directly in the product. Pour a can into a pot, and the tomatoes break apart with natural, slightly uneven texture. Piece-to-piece variation that real, minimally processed tomatoes actually carry. Not the manufactured uniformity that additives produce when the base tomato can't hold its own shape through distribution. That difference shows up before the sauce even starts to reduce. You can see it before the heat does anything. The ingredient panel matches the front of the label. After everything covered on this list, that turns out to be the rarest thing in this entire category. Not the most exotic sourcing story, not the most premium price point. Just a label that tells the truth about what's inside. That's what number 1 on the best list looks like. 10 brands, 5 that held up. Every brand on the avoid list used a different angle. Family story, Italian heritage, century-old name, corporate rebrand, budget price. Different packaging, same pattern underneath. The 5 that held up just made different choices. Cleaner ingredients, honest sourcing, nothing added to fill a gap that shouldn't be there. Next time you're in that aisle, flip the can over. Find the ingredient list. Calcium chloride, citric acid. If you see them, something was added to do the work the tomato couldn't do on its own. Then check the sodium. That one number tells you more than everything on the front of the can. The label sells you a story. The ingredient panel tells you the truth. Read that one first.